Ahsoka, Balance of Truth, Book 1, Chapter 20. Huddled closely in the confined space, Ahsoka could not have asked for a more comfortable feeling. Rubbing elbows with Kawani, who was plowing through some form of stew with reckless abandon, she noted how at ease she was. A soot-blackened hearth cuddled a small cook fire against the wall, Yoda stirring the interesting concoction occasionally in a tiny kettle hanging over it. "Master, I didn't know you could cook," Ahsoka said. "Feed myself, yes. Feed others, yes. Cook? I think not," Yoda replied with a light-hearted chirp of laughter Ahsoka wasn't sure she had ever heard before. "This is delicious," Kawani chimed in with enthusiasm between mouthfuls. "What is it?" Yoda considered it. "Of this a little, of that a little." He took a small spoonful from the pot and chewed it slowly, his eyes narrowing. Bringing a three-fingered hand to his stumbled chin, he said, "Needs something else, this does." His eyes were scouring the various shelves. Following his gaze, Ahsoka noted the small shelves created from the same mud and grasses that comprised the whole structure. She didn't, however, see anything edible that he could have been considering. "Ah, you'll do," he seemed to finalize as he strode over to a shelf. Ahsoka stopped chewing momentarily, in avid curiosity, and witnessed Yoda snap his left hand underneath the shelf faster than she thought possible and return it to his side with a barely audible snap. Ahsoka's curiosity bristled. She narrowed her eyes as he turned around to witness a headless salamander arc through the air between his tiny hand and the hovering kettle. Peripherally, she noted Kawani paying attention and stopped chewing altogether when the four-legged ingredient splashed home into the stew pot. Their eyes glanced from the lightly swaying kettle to their wooden bowls and finally at each other, unconsciously shrugging in each other's direction. Hot food is hot food. They both continued to finish their meals. "To discuss culinary arts, you did not come to Dagobah for," Yoda said, breaking into the sounds of slurping and chewing. "No, master, although we do appreciate the hospitality," Ahsoka spoke evenly. "There are questions I would ask you regarding the Force, the dark side more to the point." "A light-hearted topic, that is not." Again, he chuckled in only the way he could, Ahsoka decided, having never heard anything to compare it to. She could not help but laugh with him, more at what seemed to be an almost youthful vitality rather than the punchline to his joke. "Ahsoka," he began, adopting a more serious expression and a noticeable change in his voice. "But an element the dark side is, and only in your mind it resides. Consider this salamander you should. Responsible for its death, one could think the dark side is. But die, all living things must. Responsible for that cycle, the dark side is not, for balance is achieved. So that we may eat, the creature dies." He finished tapping the kettle with the butt end of his gimmer stick for emphasis. "I do understand that, Master, and said as much to Obi-Wan. There is only the Force. Intent places it at either end of the spectrum," Ahsoka answered. More. Greatly impact an outcome one's thought alone can. The pathway to one's destiny thinking creates," he said, striding back to the shelf to get a wooden bowl for himself. "Tempted you have been?" Kawani listened intently to the exchange, fascinated at the immediate depth with which they unhesitatingly dove. "Tempted? No," Ahsoka said, turning her face downward as she explained her escape from the Malachor temple and her account of her cruelty on Nar Shaddaa. "Ah, on Malachor this began. Reluctant to inform young Bridger I was. Much pain, sorrow, and suffering did I foresee." Yoda spoke as he sat to begin his meal with a muddled grunt. Ahsoka thought about that for a moment. There was much of that all around. Looking back up at Yoda, she wasn't quite sure how to phrase her following statement. More for Anakin, I would suspect, she decided. Unexpectedly, Yoda let out another laugh. "You've now mentioned the very things together you wish never to become. Fall prey to the dark side, you fear? That you would be entangled, like your former master?" He set his bowl down. "Ahsoka, Many Jedi have I known and trained, his full attention and gaze now upon her, that have taken my teachings to heart there are but few. Implemented two of the most difficult to practice in the same action, except for you, no one has. Kawani looked to Ahsoka for verification that she still had her faculties because she understood nothing that had just transpired. Ahsoka took the cue. Ani, those discussions we keep putting off relate heavily to this. Master Yoda is referring to my leaving the Jedi Order. Holding her right index finger, she continued, Unlearn what you have learned. My perception of what the Order had become was not something I could support any longer, so I did the only thing I felt I could do to maintain integrity. She added the middle finger to the index aloft. Do or do not. There is no try. I walked away. Ahsoka swallowed hard, and Kawani was confident she didn't want to continue. Ahsoka closed her eyes and spoke without opening them. I walked away from the Order and also, in the same action, turned my back on my former master. She finished, dropping her chin low to meet her chest. Ahsoka, blame yourself for his fall. You should not. Take responsibility for yourself. You did owe Skywalker nothing, do you do? Yoda said, pushing himself up to his feet. Tragic, his fall still is. Yoda stopped himself briefly and cocked his head to the left, deciding on his next words. He pointed a small clawed finger at her. Ah, a truth you have learned that causes doubt within. It wasn't the question. Yes, Ahsoka quietly responded, opening her eyes to gaze toward her folded legs. Kawani sensed the turmoil and a deepened sadness overtaking her Jagrutan friend. Born were new fears for yourself and your Padawan on Narshada, I sense, Yoda finished. Yes, Master. An even more downtrodden response came from Ahsoka. Unable to hold back, she shuddered and began to sob into her knees quietly. Kawani had no idea what Padawan meant, but knew through Ahsoka's admission that there was a great fear in her, and, with that thought in mind, threw her arm around her friend's head and pulled it into her shoulder. Yoda smiled broadly at the exchange. Be afraid you should not be, Ahsoka. In good hands you are, as is she. He remarked with a glance toward Kawani. I do have one question, Kawani said, finishing the embrace with a pat on Ahsoka's shoulder. Who is Skywalker? Wiping tears from her eyes, Ahsoka glanced briefly at Yoda, who nodded approvingly. My former master, Ani, Anakin Skywalker. She let the name float from her. Kawani squinted in an apparent effort to access any recollection the name might have for her. I am drawing a blank, she said. You may know him by another name, Ahsoka returned with heavy emphasis and a deliberate pause toward the end of the statement. Kawani noticed Yoda close his eyes slowly and slightly droop his head. Darth Vader, Ahsoka finished. Yes, I can see why that is incredibly heavy to bear, Kawani said after staring at Ahsoka blankly for a few awkward moments. Immediately, she had no problem accepting it as fact. Ahsoka's strange and somewhat erratic behaviors, Yoda's mannerisms throughout the exchange, and her sense of knowing told her as much. I don't understand why you had ever held yourself responsible, she said, matter of fact. I should have done more, Ani, Ahsoka tried to explain. Of what use would that have been? Yoda interjected. Change his path, you think you can? Dispel his perception of reality? Release him from the grip of the Emperor, perhaps? Yes, Master, I know that I could. Ahsoka shot to her feet, banging her mantra on the low adobe ceiling. Ah, to fulfill your guilt, you would cast reason aside. Yoda spoke slowly and calmly, folding his clawed hands atop his gimmer stick. Do nothing for your prospects of achievement, reacting on emotion will, Ahsoka. Your determination makes you powerful, but at a cost. Do you not see? Yoda said, offering a pointed finger to the top of her head, where her hand was massaging. Think, Ahsoka. If at your hand Vader falls, what would become of that which we have all sacrificed? Under the influence of Sidious, continue the line would. Luke, Ahsoka mumbled. Exactly, Yoda replied, wide-eyed and arms raised. For the same reason, on his own the truth he must learn. Ahsoka considered it for a moment and closed her eyes in a sigh. I would assume the same is true of his sister. Yoda only nodded in agreement, hiding his surprise expertly at how deeply her knowledge ran. In agreement, both Obi-Wan and I are on the destiny of his son. Of your involvement, many times we argued. Ahsoka opened her eyes and adopted a surprised expression. In what way? Master Kenobi made it very clear he didn't want me to interfere at all. Precisely why we argued, Yoda said. If nothing but stubborn Obi-Wan is. Ahsoka couldn't help but laugh at the remark. The knowledge of his progeny must be his to decipher, or face the fate of his father he will. A pathway to untap his abilities and claim that which is his is the involvement I spoke of. Obi-Wan. Yoda paused momentarily, suddenly downtrodden with a sudden wave of grief. I know, Master. Ahsoka cut him off, reached for his hand, cupped it, and overlapped her other hand. He said without saying. Yoda smiled. Overwhelming your empathy is, Ahsoka, but leaving Obi-Wan is not. His smile broadened extensively. He will be everywhere. Ahsoka did her best not to roll her eyes. Yes, Master, I understand we become one with the Force, that there is an existence beyond our mortality, she said, almost in exasperation. What Master Yoda refers to is the gift, Ahsoka. The voice of Qui-Gon interceded. A large part of the reason, in fact, that he called to you. Kawani had been following along with rapt attention up to that point, and Ahsoka assumed she'd also heard Qui-Gon. Her gaze caught Ahsoka instantly. Obi-Wan has this knowledge. They both requested of the wills and destiny that you be gifted as well. Witnessing your ability through meditation, however, I believe, as Yoda does, that you may already have that gift, or something more perhaps. Ahsoka crossed her arms before her chest and slowly walked to the doorway, letting Qui-Gon's last statement recycle through her conscious mind. Kawani made to place herself at her friend's side, but Yoda motioned for her to give Ahsoka some space. Commendable it is to see such trust shown Ahsoka. Not much she has seen in over 20 years, he said in a hushed tone, meant for Kawani's ears only. Much to think about she has. A little time we should give her. Acquainted we can become in her absence? Her mind reeling, Ahsoka unthinkingly walked hunched over through the doorway and into the inky blackness of the Dagobah night. She felt a calming relief as the cooler air washed over her, easing her mind somewhat. Closing her eyes briefly to assist in the transition to darkness, she was drawn to her questions regarding the dark side of the Force. The questions she had been armed with initially were yet unanswered, at least to her liking. She slowly opened her eyes to see the flickering of firelight from Yoda's hovel dancing across the swampy surroundings and dissipating quickly into the encroaching blackness. She laughed slightly as the irony of her surroundings reflected her thoughts, shook her head slowly, and walked off into the wall of darkness. She'll be all right then, Kawani asked. Yoda brimmed with joy. Safe she is, Miss Yamat. Rising to his feet, he shuffled slowly to the cook fire and reached for another small log to feed it. Interested I am in your story. A genuine surprise it is to hear Ahsoka taking an apprentice. He reached for a small pouch at his waist and pinched a small amount of its contents between his fingers, quickly feeding it to the fire. Not much to tell. My story isn't much different than most, I am afraid. Lost my parents to the Empire in one way or another, dead, in prison, no idea, she shrugged. I guess I did what I had to do to survive at a young age. She leaned heavily upon the commonality, digesting the worth of divulging the entirety of her truth. Yes, disrupted many things the Empire has. Families destroyed, people lost. Yoda spoke slowly, shaking his head with the same cadence. He raised his right hand to flatten his stringy white hair to his scalp. Impenetrable the Emperor is. He shook his head again, as is his empire. Kawani could not argue that point. The man seemed above reproach. Many don't even try to understand anymore. They only do what they can to provide for themselves or their families, Kawani added. Ah, Yoda took on a more attentive expression and brought his hand to his chin in contemplation. Destroy hope for civilization, the Emperor does, instilling that hopelessness to the individual to prevent revolution. Kawani didn't even give it a thought. That this is precisely what I believe is happening, but there is something deeper that I haven't figured out yet. Yoda emitted a childish chuckle again. Learning much about you, I am, Miss Yamat. You separate yourself from most just by thinking for yourself. Understand I can. What brought Ahsoka in? He finished smiling. As well as your connection to the Force. Yet speak of it you seem hesitant to do. Ask something of you I can? Of course you can, Master, she returned, unsure how to identify him. Whatever your preference is, Yoda said, the wide-eyed smile returning briefly. What connection have you had with the Force? Sense a great deal of energy within you, I can. Kawani considered the question without speaking for a moment. That energy is yours, Master. I can sense the flows of Force energy and at times with great concentration redirected, she admitted. I feel its currents flowing through all things. Mine, you say? Yoda was genuinely curious. Yes, Kawani said confidently. Perhaps it would be easier to show you? Please do! Kawani focused entirely on Yoda, feeling the boundaries of the Force flow in and out of him. She then fixated on that knowledge in her mind, overlaying it on the already memorized parameters of her own boundaries. She cut the flow into Yoda and directed it toward herself. Opening her eyes, she was surprised to see the open-mouthed look of shock on Yoda's face, and thought she had hurt him somewhere in the process. With her concentration broken, the link severed, and the flows returned to their natural state. Miss Yamat, for over 800 years have I trained Jedi, and communed with the Force. Yoda spoke quickly without moving. Almost a millennium have I lived, and never without a connection to the Force, until now. You, of course, allowed the demonstration. With resistance, it is much more difficult, but the effect is the same, she finished with ragged breaths. Formidable that skill could be. Training you need, young one. Ahsoka mentioned the same. I don't know, though, Master. She seems very hesitant, Kawani replied quizzically. A storied life that one has lived, started Yoda, speaking slowly as if through time itself. He was temporarily lost in his thoughts, focused solely on Ahsoka. She truly knew nothing but strife, war and death, betrayal and sacrifice. He recentered his gaze upon the Mirialan, sensing a truthful intensity within her. She inwardly recoiled as Yoda's gaze brought the warmth of a father's eyes and the soul-penetrating glare that begged for truth's entirety. Kawani found it challenging to withhold anything from the strange-looking Jedi Master. Despite his aged and weathered exterior, his mannerisms and charisma prompted her thoughts to expunge the totality of her past. Master, my parents were taken by the Empire. My siblings and I were separated. Globalized occupation allowed them to sort my people into camps. I have not heard from any family member in over 6 years. The words, although painful, felt good to release upon someone other than herself. Kawani let her final words die off into the silence between them, fully expecting Master Yoda to comment or offer sympathy, yet he remained silent. His broad, curious eyes invited her to continue without prompt, and more to the point, she realized, without judgment. A spark crackled within the small fire, causing the flame to burst openly with a flash of brilliance bathing them in its glow. Yoda's gaze remained focused and steady, Kawani's adopting a peace and calm, eliciting a sudden wave of deeply rooted harmony with her surroundings. Kawani felt her eyes fill with tears, knowing that the squat Jedi Master was reaching out to her with the Force, allowing it to ease whatever pain the past held for her. She toyed with the idea of diverting his efforts, but only for a moment, understanding that the act was taking root within her core and that it was one of selfless guidance toward her healing. She flushed the welling tears with a flutter of her eyes and brought her knees up to her chest, wrapping her arms around them. I don't know what happened to any of them, Master. I can only relate my own experience, she mustered through silent sobs. I was taken to an academy of sorts, one that catered to Force users, for lack of a better term. Distant shouts cut from her memory and split the silence within the hovel. Blaster fire from the past sounded out over the crackle of burning logs in the fire before them both. Kawani, realizing her memories were overriding her present. She felt the influx of Force energy from the Master before her, the gentle waves washing the memories from her emotions. Kawani adjusted herself into a more stoic position, dropping her knees to the ground and crossing her legs before her while straightening her back. She steeled her resolve to regain her lost composure and focused her mindset devoid of feeling. Feel the flow of the Force, young one. Let it consume you, Yoda said in a light whisper. Kawani could not help her reaction to his statement. Breathing deeply through her nose, she felt the Force within her, and for the first time in her life, relinquished her sense of control over it, letting it flow unhindered throughout her. She understood the Master hadn't even asked her to disclose any of her details. The need to do so began consuming her. A consenting peacefulness overtook her she could only liken to her days playing games with her father, composing poetic diatribes with her mother, or the comfort of going to sleep at night in her own home knowing she was safe. And then she understood. She was in a secure place in the here and now, where she could unburden herself from memories of her past without fear. They made us kill, Kawani began. They made us kill our own. This was easier than she had thought. I was trained to withstand assault, both physical and mental. She paused for a moment to assemble her next thought into words. Then I was trained to utilize my abilities to overcome others. That was the best way she could phrase it. The work of Sidious this is, not of the Empire. Yoda finally broke his silence, eyes widening with a hint of remorse. Kawani studied him for a long moment, sensing his comment had little to do with what she was relating, and more to do with something deeper within him. Prevented this I could have, not strong enough I was, he spoke. Kawani felt his presence, but knew his thoughts were of a distant time and a place in the galaxy. Underestimate the Emperor, we all did, he continued, turning his head to stare off into the dying fire. Smoldering embers remained under the hanging kettle, pockets of red and orange within the blackness of the ash. One last ember popped, filling the fireplace with a shower of red sparks, like the stars in the night sky, until their fire snuffed out and was swallowed up by the darkness outside.